Let's hit this little start webinar button. Okay, hello and welcome everybody to session 6 of the Conversationalist webinar series. Today's webinar is titled Mores of the Mob, Epigenetics, the Family, and the Natural Lineage of Herd Effect. We have Fred Provenza with us today, a renowned animal behavioralist, author of 3 amazing books. Nourishment is be the one that we're going to be talking about most prevalently today, and also one of the founders of Behave, an international network committed to integrating behavioral principles with local knowledge to enhance environmental, economic, and cultural values of rural and urban landscapes and communities. Fred is a dear friend, dear friend, and a mentor, a true mentor of mine, someone I deeply look up to. Fred, welcome. Thanks for being here with us today, and welcome to the Conversationalist.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. Absolutely, and to get into this topic that we're going to discuss.
Hey, the pleasure is mine. I've been looking forward to January 4th for too long, ever since you agreed to do this with us. I've truly looked forward to this moment, and so let's dive right into it. So in front of me, I was showing you this before the webinar started. In front of me, I have your book, Nourishment, published by Chelsea Green. It's easily one of, in my opinion, the best books ever written, and definitely in the top couple in the regenerative agricultural space. I'll show this to people. I don't know if you guys can see it well, but there's hundreds of sticky notes all over the place, in the top and the bottom and on the sides. I've read it, I've digested it. I think you and I could do 10 hours worth of conversations surrounding the true depth of these thoughts that you convey so eloquently in this book. But what I want to do today is just focus on a slice of it, a minor slice of it, a connection that you and I share, talking about transgenerational linkages of animals, including humans, to landscapes. So we'll talk about epigenetics, but what I really want to do is focus on the idea of the family. So in the regenerative movement today, I think a lot of us would agree that this thing, this mob grazing, management intensive grazing, adaptive grazing, all of these ideas of regenerating grasslands and silvopastures and the like with herbivores is based on the predator-prey connection. This predator-prey connection is this idea that predators push prey animals naturally in nature, and they push them forward into tight bunches, etc., X, Y, and Z. But you come at this a little bit different. You don't necessarily deny this in your book, but you go a little bit further, and then that distance that you take us, the reader, and us today, changed my life. And what I hope to do in this webinar is introduce or inoculate the thoughts and minds of everybody with us with these powerful thoughts in order to co-create a much more beautiful world. That was the lead up, Fred. The rest of this, I'm really going to push you to talk and for me to talk very little. But let's begin at the very beginning. What do you mean by transgenerational linkage to landscape? What does that mean, and what does that mean for our management of herbivores and grasslands? Let's start there.
Okay, perfect, Daniel, and great introduction and overview to all of this. You did a marvelous job of setting the stage. So the idea of transgenerational linkages then would be that mother would be, in this sense, the key. She would link her offspring with their ancestors, basically, to the landscapes they inhabit. And so you have these transgenerational linkages that then have to do with what it means, I guess I would say, to know the range. That old saying, what's it mean to know the range? Knowing the range means learning about what and what not to eat, what's a predator, what's not a predator, where to go to forage to find the best kind of mixtures of plants in different seasons, for instance. All those would be these linkages that young animals are learning from mother, really from the ancestors through mother. Then there's the whole epigenetics link to all of that too. The idea really relatively new idea that genes aren't these concrete set in stone things that we have thought about historically. I think about all that went on to decode the human genome, and some of the hopes, I guess, at the time that, well, once we get the human genome decoded, we'll have the book of life and we'll know it all. And then the realization that we really didn't know very much. And that's not being negative about all the tremendous amount that was learned, but that we really don't know very much. And that it's much more dynamic than that. In these ever-changing environments, what the genome has figured out is that it needs to be expressed as a function of what's happening in the environment. And so this beautiful field of epigenetics is just putting light on that. I'll say another thing too. You know, throughout my career, we were studying how experiences in utero early in life, do they influence what animals do, and how do they influence that? And including, we were looking at organ systems in the body. Do they change as a result of if mother's on this diet or that diet or something else? And we were seeing all these differences. But at that time, there wasn't a field of epigenetics. I'm a little bit dating myself, but I remember toward the end of my career visiting with a person who was an honest to goodness epigeneticist. And he knew of all our work. And I said, well, you know, we really weren't studying epigenetics. And he said, yes, you were. And I said, yeah, we were, weren't we? And we just weren't looking at what genes were being expressed. But he got that. He got that all the things, the behaviors we were looking at, the changes in rumen volume, in liver, in kidneys, in nervous system as a function of experience, all those were epigenetic kinds of things. So then you can think that these experiences with the physical environment as well as the social environment influence form, function, and behavior of animals. And that all is part of these transgenerational linkages to landscapes.
Wow. Wow, I like that form, function, and behavior. Understanding that genes have to be expressed, that they're not static or concrete. Words that you use. That's brilliant. So in your book, I want to put some order to this because my mind wants to run and have a very large 300-page conversation with you. So I'm going to keep it focused. In your book, you have a section, the values of social organization and culture, looking at social organization and culture and how it applies to managing herbivores. That's why I want to extract this. I know you're not necessarily talking about that here, but you are in a tangential way. And I want to read you something that you wrote. As an author myself, I hate this, so I'm sorry to put you in this to listen to your own words, but I'm going to do it anyways for the sake of our guests. You write, yet predators such as wolves have little influence on bison numbers or movements, chiefly because bison are dangerous prey for predators. And the same is true for many large herbivores in Africa. Some ranchers now encourage the natural herd instinct of cattle, unaware their natural herd instinct is to live in extended families. And so what I want to do here in the beginning, with the foundation that you just so conveyed for us, that you built for us with the understanding of linkages to landscapes, going down the matriarchal line, what I want to do is maybe let's start here. What do we mean that the predator-prey connection has more to do with families than pressure? Is that what I'm understanding you're saying? Or better define
yes.
that?
And I was, you know, and so let me say a word first about the, you know, mob grazing and management intensive grazing to say a good word for that. You know, this idea of thinking about how animals are managed and trying to work with animals and plants to create healthy ecosystems, a tremendous value and tremendous amount of good for landscapes has come out of that. So in anything I say, it's with that by way of a background. But what really struck me, and it struck me when we started doing our research with bison and starting to look at extended families, and there's a fella that really, you know, got me interested in that. I was giving a talk about our work on mother and transgenerational linkages at a workshop and he was in the audience and came up, and we had long conversation after that. Well, it turns out that the man's name was Bob Jackson. He'd been a backcountry ranger in Yellowstone for 30 years. And he's absolutely myopically focused and fixated on bison. That is his creature. And since he retired, and prior to that, during the winter months, he would spend his time in Iowa, where he was raising bison in extended families. So he's really legit. And he's the one I want to mention, because he's the one that really got me thinking about extended families. And we talked and talked, and he was an amazing source of books and books and books about bison and what people had observed when they were out here with bison. And so he really got me thinking about, it's not only mother as a transgenerational linkage, but mother as a part of extended families. And so then we started research on extended families, and just this whole appreciation of the value of family. Since Nourishment was published, I've read articles published on research in Yellowstone National Park, and they're pointing out that when you have intact families, depredation by wolves is very, very low. They just don't fool around with those family units. It's too formidable to do that. But let's say that by and large, there's always exceptions to every rule, right? But if you have dysfunction, if you have dysfunctional kinds of units, then that's where the bison are more susceptible to the wolves, was the conclusion of one of the recent papers that I was reading. So this idea of families and extended families, and I think because people don't appreciate what we're talking about, I'm thinking of some people we worked with over the years that were interested in bison and having bison rather than cattle on their properties. And they assume that if we buy bison from wherever you can get them and put them on the place, the bison will just roam, like they used to roam. Theoretically, like they used to roam. They didn't see any of that at all. Yeah. And when you step back and think, the whole organization that would have been present back in the day of extended families, interactions that may have occurred amongst families. One of the things we were really interested in trying to study, and my career came to an end before we fully got there, was through extended families, can you end up with rotational grazing without fences? And I mentioned that in the book. That's speculative, of course, but this whole idea of what kind of dynamic do you get amongst different intact families? I think if I were a young person starting out, that's something I would really be interested in trying to study. If a person could find a place where people have allowed families to develop, and then look at what kind of relationships and interrelationships do they have, and does that influence their movements around landscapes, as another way to think about this dynamic. Yeah. Beyond that, though, when I got more involved in our research on extended families and started reading more broadly in the literature about a variety of different wild herbivores, most of them lived in extended families. So it was just like, wow, it makes sense. It makes sense for a whole bunch of reasons. The value of families and the way that they can support one another, the different roles that different members of those families plays. It takes you much more deeply thought-wise into these creatures aren't simply little automatrons, so to speak, each independent. They're functionally linked with one another, and then with their landscapes as well.
That's brilliant. Let's clarify some terms just for my sake, and maybe some of the listeners here have the same clarification needs. When we're saying families, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that cows, mother cattle, right, female reproducible cattle, are having calves that stay with them, right? Or is there something else you're talking about? What do you mean by families and extended families? Let's get into that.
Very good point of clarification. So these are, in the literature, are referred to as matrilines. And there's a very specific connotation that comes with that matriline. So it's primarily the females, and you'll have, the offspring, mother, grandmother, great grandmother, great, for many, many generations back, you'll have all these females in the matriline. Now, the young males are originally a part of those groups as well, but as they age, then they move off into bachelor groups, and so you'll have different kind of organization, social organization that involves the females and extended families and the young males, and then the older adult males. And I remember I was in Africa years ago at Addo Game Park, and that park is renowned for the elephants in the park. And we went out with the biologists early in the morning, and I think there were roughly 350 elephants in that park, and they had identified every one of them. They were each one named, and they could recognize them, by their facial characteristics. And we were there at the water hole, and this one family came in, and there was a little tiny young one there, and they said, "Yeah, we know that one." We gave her name Lucy, whatever. I'm making that, but he was the young one, and it was amazing. It was just amazing to see that. And they came in independent groups, and then went out. And then I remember we had a seminar from the head biologist there at the park, and he was talking about social organization and how their knowledge of social organization had changed the way that they managed the park. For instance, if they're going to move elephants into an area that they had formerly occupied, that they had been removed from for whatever reason. He said, now we made sure that we moved the entire family. We didn't just trap at random, we moved the family. Even though they would go to a new environment and maybe didn't know that, at least they would have that family for support, and once they got to the new environment. And then he said, but when we were doing that initially, we'd never moved some of the big bulls with them, because just pretty formidable to try to deal with them. But he said, we learned from that too. He said, these young males that were moved with as part of this matriline would come into heat, into must, if I recall the term right, into must, and try to breed the old cows who weren't interested in that, and so forth. And I don't think he was making this up, because I heard it from several others, trying to breed white rhinos and so forth. And so, it was a mess. But he said, when we brought those mature males in, that changed the whole dynamic of those young males and what went on. And he concluded, and that's part why I'm saying this, he said, I think we barely understand all that goes on socially with these animals, and the importance for ecological systems of that. So that, that's when we were doing some of our work with bison on extended families, and really becoming aware of that, and seeing the elephants in Addo, and then listening to his seminar. Just, it's amazing how quickly a lifetime, a career goes, but I could see how quickly a career could go just studying social organization in some of these wild animals, and then how that influences their relationship. For instance, Yellowstone would have been a great place, when they, with the reintroduction of the wolves to Yellowstone and the bison that were in Yellowstone, if a person had the knowledge, it would be very interesting. And of course, as I was mentioning, some people are actually starting to study that. What are the depredation rates on these intact families versus ones that aren't intact, and so forth.
Yeah. Wow, that's powerful. One of the foundational tenets, if we can call it a tenet, of holistic management, Robinio, we're a Mid-Atlantic hub of the Savory Institute, a practitioner and teacher of managing holistically. One of the foundational tenets is this unmechanization, this delinearization of our mental process and how we manage. And it seems to me that this conversation, this focus on social organization, on matriarchal lines, on transgenerational, linkages to landscape, all of these things are pushing towards really a state of holism, right? That when we're focused on mob grazing, we're not just and only narrowly focused on becoming the wolf, right? As some ranchers and farmers think that they are. I'm the wolf. I mob my animals close together for protection. But maybe, just maybe, there's something more there. And then what you're claiming that I'm understanding is that perhaps one of the secondary, or maybe one of the adjoining features of mob grazing, of relational herbivores in pastured landscapes, meadowland, shrubland, silvopastures, whatever it is that families matter, right? And we build those through matriarchal lines, which you've done so well. But why do we do this? The next part in the book, it gets into this understanding of historical context. And you write, we interpret snapshots of the past, of times past, the way things used to be to fit agendas, right? A person who favors grazing by large mobs of livestock can emphasize historical accounts of bison herds million strong, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've heard this, right? This European settlers come over, they see millions of herds of bison working together. They write it down in the diary. We see it, as the Bible written stone. But you make this comment, and here's my question. You write, whenever they stampeded, they did come together and they charged as one vast solid herd. But when the fright, the predation, the scare, the stress, if you will, when that fright had passed away, it had alleviated itself from the system, they'd separate into their peculiar small herd formations. And so the question is this: mob grazing in modern times, in a linear way, to me, that means we're densely stocking and rotating and moving our herbivores in pastures tightly at all times in the year, or at least to the best of our human abilities or infrastructure capabilities. But you're talking about a pulsating pattern, that herbivores come together and then they leave each other. And then that pulsating pattern is somehow not only holistic, but historical. We dive into that. So the question is, what do I mean? What do you mean? And enlighten us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you're saying those words, I'm thinking of wild animals that I've interacted with quite a lot. Elk, for instance. I'm thinking during the winter time, the huge herds that they would form in some of the areas, huge, anywhere from 100 to 1,000 or so. Just here in the Madison Valley where we are right now, boy, there's huge, thousands of elk that are down on these winter ranges, so that they're congregated into these really massive herds that are utilizing the landscapes. But when spring and summer come, they disperse, and they disperse broadly across these landscapes, and they end up in these little groups, then in these tiny groups, like you were talking about there. And I've been thinking a lot about that lately with cattle. There are many things that have gotten me thinking about that, but we were hiking in what's referred to as the Gravelly Range, which is south and east of us here in Innis this spring, and the cattle were out on the range, and they weren't in one mob. They were dispersed, and so you'd see these little groups scattered all across that landscape too. And then I went to Durango, Colorado, southwestern part of Colorado, and we were up on this huge area called Missionary Ridge, and I was seeing these cattle, huge rangeland in these tiny groups again. And it was all making me think back to the 7 years I spent on the ranch in Colorado. And back in those days, we moved seasonally. The cattle wintered down at the home place at about 8,600 feet elevation, and then they would move seasonally onto Bureau of Land Management administered land, then up to Forest Service land, up to about 11,000 feet in elevation. And we would move them seasonally, and we'd move them as a large group. And then they'd disperse into these little groups. And no matter where back in those days, rest rotation grazing was really a common way. And the idea, it was trying to think about, how do we not graze plants the same way year after year after year? How do we keep diversity of plants? So it was really good in that sense. And that's what we were on. So we'd move into these huge pastures, nothing like what a person would think about today with mob grazing these times. We'd move, and again, the animals would disperse into these little groups, and they would use areas where they where they were, certainly, and then we would be the predator. We'd come in, we'd move them, and they would disperse into their small groups once again. And it just got me thinking about those small groups. Henry DeLuca was the owner of the ranch. That he was like a father to me over those years, really, very, very close. And we used to talk about this idea of what's it mean to know the range. I remember asking Henry way back after I'd taken a class in genetics about heterosis and all that. And I said, well, Henry, I know you Herefords are your animal, right? That's all he wanted, was the breed that he loved. And I said, what about crossbreeding? And why don't you bring replacement? We always kept our own replacement animals. I said, why don't you do that? And sat down and I always appreciated that. He was back from the hard work day, right? I mean, when you were working there for him, it was 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And so it was that era, but he would always take time to tell stories. His knowledge came to his brain through his hands. He had no formal education. He had a lifetime of just working. And so I would listen, and he told me lots of stories. He said, I've brought replacements in here, but he said, the problem is, how when we go up and we're going to move cattle from such and such pasture to such, and we had names for these, and he said, we've got to go check Droney, and we've got to check Wellington, and these different places. And I knew all this from doing that. He said, when you bring animals that don't know the range up here, you don't know if you're going to find them, you don't know where you're going to find them, and they're not going to be bred. They're not going to be bred. So he summed it all up by saying, well, the problem is the animals just don't know the range. And so I think about that. And then I think, what were those little groups? And I think, well, they were the rudiments of extended families, is basically what they were. And so how did he get use of landscapes? I mean, we think about putting all the animals into a mob and moving them, which certainly can accomplish that, and it can accomplish time control. So again, trying to be very positive on, but you can also get all of that through these different families that disperse to different areas. And then, as we were in those days, the rest rotation while you're moving them, but they're dispersing to other areas. Now, I remember reading back in the day about research on families, what were truly extended families over in the UK. In this case, it was sheep rather than cattle. And the studies they were doing were habitat selection studies. And they were talking about when they'd bring the sheep in, say 1,000 head of sheep, and they'd work them or do whatever, how they would stay in those little groups. Basically, if you were watching them, if you were doing gate cuts and running them through a chute and you had them ear tagged, you would see, hey, there's these ones are part of a family. But then when they turn them back out on the landscape, they'd disperse and they'd go to these other areas. So they were getting this broad use of the landscape through these extended families. Now, when hoof and mouth came in and they had to destroy all of those animals, I remember reading an article, and some of the political people were saying, well, this is tough. We'll try to support you. Just go buy some more sheep. And what the sheep people were saying is, you don't understand all the layers upon layers of knowledge that was in these animals about how to use landscapes and where to go in landscapes. You can't just buy animals and put them back out there and have the same thing. So it was that deep appreciation that they had of the families and the way that families dispersed across those landscapes to get more uniform years. And then what you were moving, in a sense, as a quote predator, would be families, how you would move. That's what I think when I think now, with our conversation in mind, of what we were doing is we'd move across this big Mount Shavanaugh area and move from one pasture to the next. That's really what I think we were doing, is moving families, and they knew the range and they dispersed according to how their family used the range and so forth and so on.
Right. Wow. Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I mean,
well,
Fred, I know.
Daniel, I'm going to interrupt you just to say, I think what you're doing is fantastic, actually, with this. And I tell you why, because I think this idea of holism and that's why I wrote that in the book, how do natural systems work? And it's true, we take snapshots in time, right? And then if it fits what we want, and so probably all those things were happening. You did have big mobs, but you also had these peculiar small groups. And I think what's neat about what you're doing and what's been neat about the whole holistic movement is pushing the bounds, right? Constantly pushing the bounds and causing us to think about holistic practices, moving away, which is more urgent now than ever, from all the fossil fuel-based dependencies that we have. And so I'll let you keep going, but I wanted to be sure to insert, I think that's wonderful and I think it's timely. The systems are constantly changing, right? And so what worked 50 years ago is so outdated today, and it's going to be outdated in 50 years. So the key is to try to keep the mind open, to not lock into anything. I always thought when I started in research, if we could understand principles and processes, how do natural systems function? And then maybe try to mimic those. And so I really appreciate, that's a long digression, but I appreciate what you're trying to do in that sense. And I'll let you keep going.
Oh, I thank you for the moment. No, we're and you've read my book Wild Like Flowers, so you know this. Our interest in these systems wasn't because of any sort of intellectual or soul work, any sort of thing that we did. And I'll let you guys read the book, but in Wild Like Flowers is a chapter where we detail this, how we let go and how we started to understand the role of the family in mob grazing and holistic grazing systems, and how in our opinion, we're a little bit missing the mark in this modern regenerative movement, in the sense that it's tending towards, so in commercialized agriculture, right, you have a linearization of production for profit. And none of those things are entirely negative or corrupt or evil in and of themselves, but they have evil or maybe just corruptible or negative or degenerative products that come out of it. Degenerating systems, species, diversity loss, erosion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, carbon, excess of carbon in the atmosphere, as I said, et cetera. And a transition away from that isn't just a transition in systems, right? Which is why I'm so into this conversation, and Fred, and why I was so excited for it, because this is not a conversation about practices. Although we're saying that we're focusing on families, right? And in some sense, that's gearing towards a practice, but it's a re-gearing of our mind's eye, or maybe I should say the eyes of our heart, to see what we really, really want to be true in the landscape is true, right? That the human and very animalistic urge that we believe to be humans need relationship, community, social structures in order to live happy, abundant, and fruitful lives, that these same things exist in nature. Right, that this one thrush that was sitting, on our windowsill just outside this morning, it's not just one thrush. It lives in a community, and that community matters to the health of the thrush, but also the health of the whole. And so no, this is pivotal for me. I mean, I'm deeply enjoying this.
That's fantastic what you just said on that, Daniel, and that's right. That thrush is a part of a community, huh? And that community knows one another. I often think when talking about, whether it's a thrush or a mountain bluebird or any of the creatures we've been discussing, that know the range. They learn about one another across species as well, right? So the thrush makes a call that's an alarm call, and other creatures, not its species, learn, oh, that thrush is saying, it's amazing. And coming to appreciate those kind of linkages. And you do a wonderful job of talking about those, of expressing those in poetic terms in your book too, to put a plug in for that as well. I think that's, it's the heart. It's at the heart level that we really need to connect, right? And that we emphasize so much the cognitive, rational, analytical, to the detriment of that heart level. And your book is going at the heart level, huh? And the realizations that you're having and so forth that you were alluding to are so nicely expressed in that sense in the book.
Yeah, as is yours. As is yours. So You made the comment earlier that families are formidable, and I believe those are the words that you use, and I love that. It's a great way of looking at this. Families are formidable, the formidable force of safety, right? And in terms of predation and the predator-prey connection and other things. You were talking about a changing climate, a little bit, and I don't want to harken on climate change or carbon sequestration or any of that. That's not the topic of today's conversation. But let's talk about the epigenetic resilience that a formidable family conveys in any sort of community.
Yes,
Let's dive into
absolutely.
that a little
Two
bit.
things pop into mind when I see that. I used to show a video when we would talk about this, about a grizzly bear trying to attack a bison family. And this huge bull comes roaring out and just smashes that grizzly, So there you've got like this whole, they are formidable, right? And I'll send you that video, but it was just, boy, you get that. Another thing came into my mind, and it's from a colleague in New Zealand. Pablo Gregorini is his name. And I had probably a 2-hour or more talk with Pablo before Christmas time. He's doing just some marvelous work that relates to this topic that we're discussing in a bit broader sense of the value of biodiversity and plant diversity for animals. The reason I bring that up, though, is one of the studies they did was looking at pregnant ewes and whether they had a variety of different foods in their diet, different plant species, or if they were severely restricted. Now, restricted in the sense that you might feed in New Zealand, a species or two. And then what they did at birth was to take hair samples of those offspring and look at the amount of cortisol that was in those hair samples. Cortisol is a measure of the stress that they're experiencing. And here are these young ones that their mother had eaten a really diverse diet and presumably was much better off in, we would say, nutrition, but it's broader than that. They have no cortisol in their wool. The others have high levels of cortisol. It's at these kind of levels. And so then you think, okay, that's food, and we focused a lot in my work on food. But then you think, well, what are the influences if you're surrounded by family where you have your aunts and your great aunts? And that can sound funny to say that for these creatures, but it's true. And there's a lady in Tasmania, Nanbra is her name, who took a 2-week short course that we used to teach at Utah State University. And it was a very hands-on. It was in class, but very hands-on too. So people were working with animals and seeing these things happen, and it changes when you see mother influencing her offspring and these things. It really gets you to realize how important that is. But so she went back to Tasmania, and she has a white gum wool as her operation, fabulous products that she produces. But she said, I'm going to start raising these animals in extended families. And some of what she wrote about, what she saw, the calmness that came over those animals, that just, from being with family. And then I think about a lot. When I grew up in this town of Salida, it was a small town, and everybody pretty much knew everyone else in one way or another. But I think about growing up in that town and what a sense of community there was from that. And you just felt, you felt two things. One, that anything bad you do, it's going to get back to your family in a hurry. But two, you felt this kind of support that was around you, and having grandparents and great aunts and great uncles around. And I think of that. And I think too, how much for me, sitting listening to those old people. And it's funny to say this, because when you're young, especially your parents, that's the last thing you listen to. But listening to these old people talk, it was somehow that you just knew that after a lifetime on this planet, they knew things. Huh? It wasn't formal knowledge, and none of them had any of that in my family to speak of. The older ones, they didn't go if they even went to high school. They certainly didn't go to college, but it was just interesting and a life kind of knowledge that was being passed down. And so, I think about that a lot when I think, and I appreciate so much what you're saying in that sense about these broader families and what are the implications of that. And then if you want to get into, Pablo and I were talking about comparing feedlot kind of system versus animals out on rangelands, and if they're in extended families and so forth. And some of the research that I'm a cheerleader on, that Stefan von Vliet and Scott Kronberg's involved and some others, but looking at phytochemical and biochemical characteristics of meat and milk and those kind of things, it goes right, that it translates right down. That's being just as that cortisol in the wool was being expressed, these other things are being expressed too. And sometimes I have friends that when we talk about meat, and they're very pro meat, and I understand that, but maybe not so discriminating. Meat is meat is meat is meat, and wrote an article a few years ago making the point: meat isn't meat. It really depends on the characteristics of the landscapes that those animals are foraging on, what they've learned to eat, how broad their diets are, and so forth. And now with the work that Stefan's doing, and just completed an amazing study with bison that are finished in a feedlot versus bison that are out on ranges in their families, that meat is so different, one from the next. And so it's kind of, I'm saying that because when people talk about, meat versus meat, it's like, no, it's much broader than that. It's the whole system, right? It's this idea that plants turn dirt into soil, diverse mixtures of plants turn soil into homes, grocery stores, and pharmacies for creatures below and above ground. And then how those creatures use that landscape and learn to use that, and the families. It is very much about wholes, huh? And so if you just say, well, we think you should eat meat, whether it comes from a feedlot or wherever, it's missing that broader point that you're making so nicely. It's about the linkages from soil through plant diversity, through communities of plants and animals, right through to our health and well-being. And when we break those linkages, when we don't think about the kind of issues that you're raising, I think then we do a disservice not only to the creatures in our care, but to ourselves as well, right? As peoples, we've really, and I remember this growing up, the old people would say, well, you're going to have to move away from this little town. You may like it here, you like all this, but there's no jobs for you. That's what they said. There's no jobs, there's no work here, you have to go. And over the years, we've totally done away with extended families, which is how our ancestors were, and then clans and tribes. And what have we lost? What have we lost when we've broken our transgenerational linkages to landscapes? I think about all the time, and I know that's what you're thinking about in all that you're saying in this conversation as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there in that last comment, we see the true broad understanding of what extended families really means. Because not just, I think, if I understand you correctly, not just are we talking about matriarchal bloodlines, we're talking about communities of relationship, right? Like, we live here in Central Virginia. We call it the middle of nowhere. We're about 20 miles from, anything that has anything for us. About an hour away from the closest city, and it's just neighbors out here, right? You survive when your tractor breaks or your tractor gets stuck. Your neighbor better pull you out, or it sits there for 100 years until people forget about it, or a tree grows out of the engine. That's all you have, right? So you're dependent upon those relationships, and correct me if I'm wrong, that is a part of the extended family as well, right? The idea here is not just to create a system that keeps replacement heifers. We are talking about that in some way. But we're talking about creating and nurturing, maybe as a much better word, of cultivating communities inside of the herds and within the herds and around the herds and other communities that are tangential and interdependent upon the herds, right? It's about a massive relationship, a community of life operating as one single whole, their abundances. And part of that abundance is that center family, right? The matriarchal line that you're talking about, but it's also that epigenetic reality of all life emerging and evolving within itself and for itself and around itself. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes, and that's what you're so. And in that sense, then it is epigenetically being expressed in every being in those environments, right? From the microorganisms in the soil and their relationship with the plant, and the plant's relationship with the herbivores, and there with the carnivores and with us. And in that sense, then, and this gets a spiritual way of thing, but then we could realize, Daniel, that we're all family, right? We're all in a sense, as the mystics like to say, we're all manifestations of being, how we are all being manifest in that beautiful sense. I think it's a recognition of that. And so when you help your neighbor, or your neighbor helps you, or you do, I used to think this all the time when I was working, and I still do, but at the, it's really about how do you love your neighbor and love those around you, right? In that sense, that energy that we refer to as love. How, and in everything we do, we can be showing that. And so when you're helping your neighbor, that is a recognition that is extended family, so to speak, right? And
Yep.
and in the end, then it's about our relationships and interrelationships with one another and the communities that we where we live, huh?
Right. Absolutely. It's why I hate to keep going back to my book, but the subtitle is all about the regeneration of relationship. That is what regenerative agriculture is. It's a relationship, and in that relationship, we have so many pathways, so many conversations that we need to have. The book doesn't cover all of them. Even your 300-400 page, unbelievable, magnanimous work here doesn't cover all of them. Nature is that complex, but they're beginning to be had, which is absolutely beautiful. And so let's actually
One other comment before
go
you
ahead,
launch
please.
into that. I think that's right. I think the key, as you stated so nicely in your book, and all, it's just an appreciation of those relationships, huh? And then we know there's no end, right? The more we come to learn about it, but if we can just appreciate that all that's happening, then that opens the mind to constantly be thinking along those lines. Keep going, but I think that's such a key point you're making in the book, and that we're trying to make here. It's about, and creativity is flowing out of those relationships. I often think back to my years at Utah State working with graduate students, and we received a lot of accolades for our work, but when I left and went to Australia for a year and thought about it, what struck me at the heart level was, it wasn't for us, it was fun, neat things we were doing in the accolades. It was the relationships. And I thought that's why all this creativity is coming. It's because we're loving, fun, interesting. It's the relationships. And I think that's where the points you're making in the book are so critical, huh? It's about relationships.
Right. You need relationships to have transgenerational linkage over a period of time, right? We can't totally be transient. Transient is relationshipless. Well, anyways, I love where the conversation has gone, but I do want to open it up to the people, you 100 or so people that have stuck with us. And if you guys have any questions, please put it in the Q&A in the chat box. I will read through the questions that are asked, and I'll throw them at Fred and see if he has any thoughts. This is your time. And by the way, if you've been with us on other webinars, if you guys don't ask questions, I'll just ask questions, and I'll totally love to do that. Fred and I can talk for hours. And so if you have questions, please be selfish, take over, and we'll get them answered. We have one question here from Cody. So he runs a large bison herd and is transitioning this year to a no-wean single herd system, grazed rotationally. What he's asking is, as we make these changes, hold on, they're coming in and my thing's moving. As we make these changes, do you know of any behavioral changes that they ought to look out for to monitor if we are encouraging the development of extended families? So what sort of behavioral observations can land managers, bison managers, cattle managers observe to narrow in on to see if this is a positive or negative familial change?
Yeah, that's an excellent kind of question. And some of the research we got involved in when we started the work with bison was doing just what you're doing. The people we were working with had not in any way attempted to encourage extended families. And then what we did with them, they decided that they wanted to do that. And so they started to keep the offspring and keep them with mother. And we were simply watching the evolution of these families over time. That's obviously a long-term kind of endeavor. And we just watched the first few years of that. I think things that I would be looking at nowadays is just, and that Nan talks about, the degree of stress that animals may experience as you build those families versus animals that aren't. Or, if you're doing that with the herd as a whole, you might be thinking about how did the animals behave prior to when you initiated this change, and then become very, very aware of what kind of changes are you seeing in their levels of stress, in their relationships with one another, and so forth. It's really a marvelous opportunity that I think that's fantastic that you're doing that. And what I ought to do too is get you in touch with Nan Bray in Tasmania. And she would be able to, you would have wonderful conversation about some of the things that she saw. And I'll also try to find a note that she wrote me related to that and forward that on to you, Daniel, that you could forward on about some of the things that she was, she didn't set out to observe anything per se, but there were so many things that happened as she moved in that direction that took her by surprise, I think. And they were good. They were good things. It wasn't bad things that were happening.
Right. Wow. Yeah, absolutely. The questions are coming in, so I'll move on. But yes, please do send that over, and we'll shoot it out to everybody. That'd be a great.
Okay, I'll do it.
Emily is asking a brilliant question. It's actually one of the questions I wanted to ask. So thank you, Emily. She says, she questions, I wonder if there's anything Fred especially wants us livestock farmers to know that didn't make it in your book, Nourishment. So what isn't in this text that you would like, maybe even now after you've wrote the book, us livestock farmers to know? Is there anything?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to give that one. I'll have to give that one some thought. I'm working on a narrative for an audio book for Nourishment, and I'm not going to just sit and read the book. I'm sort of trying to update things that were talked about. Keep the same flavor, absolutely, not the detail, but the same flavor, and going through and just in some ways I'm updating some of the particulars related to some of what was in the book. But I was really, when I wrote that book, was a time of reflection for me, of just reflecting over the years. And I really, in that basically 10 years I wrote the book, really tried to pour my soul into it, of thoughts that I had and things that seemed to be worthwhile, including as it moved into those last two sections on grappling with uncertainty and fading into mystery, the mystery and wonder of it all. That to me, at my age now, is what I spend much time thinking about, the uncertainty and the mystery and wonder and the different stages of a life, as the Hindus would talk about them. The first stage, which is preparation, then the second stage where you're in full force and doing your thing, the third stage when go to the forest, which is really writing that book, and then the last stage when you prepare for the exit, right? That they talk about enlightenment and those kind of things, and that's that last stage where I'm thinking about a lot now. So it's maybe not quite so much. Well, it is, I guess, for any time in life, something to be pondering. But I very much find, as I'm working on this narrative, that my heart is in that kind of last stage now. Those from the forest stage to the exit stage, and it's beyond what we have time to do here. But some of what I wrote about in Nourishment in that last section, especially what happened with depression and cancer. I've had some huge revelations related to cancer, and it came last winter, which is amazing to me, 22 years later. But I think about those things a lot, and it goes beyond what we have time to get into now. So I'll let some of that go. But that's what I'm thinking about and writing about a lot nowadays. Is it's just that stage of life for me, going into that last stage.
We'll have to do this again. We'll have to do this again.
It would be fun to do it on that part and bring some of that into, because it's so much a part of our lives, and it's become really really poignant in some wonderful ways for me now. And with all that's going on now in society and around the globe and all the issues, it would be really fun to do something like that, I think, and worthwhile.
We'll do it. The questions are pouring in, and I want to respect as many of these as we can. Brian, I'll continue. Brian asks, with a lack of families in beef production now, could that explain the fact of more health issues today? So the lack of families creating, unhealthy beef and unhealthy humans that consume it. Is there a relationship there? A correlation?
To me, that's an excellent question for nowadays. It's not one that we would have been thinking about years ago, right? We wouldn't, for instance, after World War II, when everything moved more toward feedlot systems and away from pasture and rangeland-based systems. But I think that's the kind of question I'm thinking about nowadays. That really is. So that's something that isn't maybe in Nourishment, but that tying back with the last question, but that, all that relates to health in the broadest sense, does it not? That whole idea of and I think when we think in more linear kind of ways, we don't tend to think of those things, but that whole idea of can the health and well-being of the animals that we're raising that then become food to nourish us, what influence does how they're born and raised and treated and then in their last days of life have on our health? And that's certainly what Stefan, what we're getting into with these studies. I'll share, Daniel, with you some highlights of some of that bison. But when you look at those animals and what's happening, let's take the bison that are in the family groups out on rangelands versus the one in feedlots. The one in feedlots are really, as they are finishing, their health is much like that of a human with metabolic syndrome. They have all of the symptoms of metabolic syndrome. And you start thinking about that, and then like my friend Pablo Gregorini says, and then we eat that, right? And then we eat that. So I think that question is right on, and where Stefan's going, and that I'll send you some highlights of that bison work. That really, the differences were far greater than Stefan expected. I not for me. I thought they would be pretty big on the phytochemical richness of that meat of bison from rangelands. But then the whole, Stefan's a nutritionist, a human nutritionist. His studies have been of these kind of things and metabolic health. And he said, man, when you look at the tissues of those animals and you look at their metabolic profiles, they're like a human with metabolic syndrome. They're not in good shape, And so, yeah, that's, I think, a really good question. to what degree then? So I often tend to think of diet because we studied diet so much, but it's broader than just diet, right? You've got them out there on rangelands, you've got them with families, you've got them in such a different condition compared to when you wean them, put them in tight confinement into a feedlot and stuff. The amount of stress and all that's going to be influencing what we get. So it goes back to those linkages that we've been discussing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. I'll pass along some of that to you, Daniel, as well. We've written a report for the people who are funding that work, and the next step will be a paper. I probably dare not send that report, but I can't wait till we write that paper and submit that, because it's really it's amazing. The differences are really, really amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. When the report is written and you can publish it and share it, please do. And our institute, Urbinia, will make it widely accessible to anybody who's interested. It to me is the next step. And obviously, Fred, you are so much more intelligent, wise, and brilliant than I am. And I just see it with my own eyes. And
Not true on that.
Oh, okay.
just
you
try
have the
to
science
bring into a lot of good people like you.
Well, the point, I think I really do believe it is the next step. Right now, we have emerged out of this organic revolution, not emerged out of in the sense that we're past it, but in some sense we've gotten there, right? Or organic food is something that is accessible to most communities in the United States here. And most communities care about them. And then now we start to have land-based verification systems like Savory's EOV protocol and others, Rodale's regenerative organic certification. But there's another thing happening here. And it's a conversation in the previous time, right before the holiday season, we got to share a conversation with Dan Kittredge, who I know you know well. And we were talking about how if feelings manifest themselves in chemical forms inside of the body, and chemicals we understand to be transferable either in a mammal's milk or in the blood system, then we are transferring chemicals. When we're eating unhappy cows, we're creating unhappy humans. The science is not totally there yet, but the idea is there, right? And so as we progress into this hopefully much more beautiful world, we're working to work inside of families, not just for mop grazing for stock density, but for family creation.
Absolutely the case with everything you say. And just think back to that study that Pablo did, where this young lamb just born, and you look at the cortisol in the wool of the one that has, the mother's less stressed, more diverse. Those are chemicals, stress hormone in this case, that are, so that's, you just have no question that's going to show up. And it starts, speaking of these linkages, it starts in the womb, and then the sins of the grandmothers and grandfathers, I guess. I mean, it's amazing when you start thinking of those temporal and spatial linkages. But then, as we were talking earlier, when you start to move toward extended families, and then, I remember reading an article years ago. I was coming back from Uruguay from some work I'd done in Uruguay. I was reading an article on a plane, and it was about a lady, former vegetarian, who'd moved to New York, and title of the article is "Beef is Bueno." And she was talking about these things, but she said, in Argentina, I think it was Argentina, where she said that they walk around on rangelands or whatever. They live in families, and for their short life, they have and it's like, and that was many years ago, but it's timely now, though, with our concerns about environmental health and what animals can do to improve that, human health, and those linkages. It's really timely.
Again, we're back to relationship.
Yeah.
And we're back to relationship. Fred, I'll have you make the game time decision. I'm happy to stay on. More questions keep coming. Do you have another 10 or so minutes to keep going?
Yes, yeah, I'm happy to too. I certainly am. So let's take the questions.
Marvelous. Catherine throws us a two-parter. Roughly, she's wondering about the time in which it takes and how many generations need to occur to establish these sort of relationships within a herd. They're in year 3 and they're in the Scottish Highlands. Any thoughts for Catherine?
Yes. Well, I don't have, Catherine, any definitive answer to your question, but when we were doing research and when we had the Behave program going strong, we were working a lot with livestock producers. And when they would change their management, we were trying to help with this, what we called the adaptation trough. So you want to manage in a different way. And you're here, but you know that performance is probably going to go down when you make radical changes in grazing management. Not that it has to, but so we used to think, how can we help people to minimize that adaptation trough? But some of the studies that we were doing, for instance, we were doing work in utero and early in life, animals that were exposed to poor quality forages during pregnancy. So think of an animal that's wintering in our part of the country up here, mature forages, not good quality. It's tough conditions. So we're trying to say, well, if a mother is wintered under those conditions versus fed good quality food, does that influence the offspring and so forth? And we were showing that in utero, calves exposed to whose mothers were eating poor quality forage, they eat more poor quality forage, they digest it better. Then we did another study where calves were exposed early in life, and then we didn't do any tests until 5 years later. And then these poor quality forages were the bulk of the diet from December through May. And throughout all 3 years of that study, we saw significant differences between animals that were exposed to poor quality forages and those that were on better quality forages. But here's the thing. The first year, the differences were really large. The next year, they were less. The next year, they were even less. So we used to talk about, I'm winding my way along, but we used to say, it's about 3 years to get through that trough. And then we started working with people like Ray Bannister, who was changing food selection behaviors of his cattle. And we were asking, well, you did that in the first year was pretty tough, next year better. How long? He said, well, it's about 3 years. And then we were talking with Bob Budd, who changed habitat selection, changed the culture of his cows from bottom dwellers into upland aficionados, as we used to say. And he said, well, it was about 3 years. So that 3 years is probably not a bad kind of way, quote, to think about some of this stuff, with each year getting better and better. It would be fun to have a conversation with you about that. I'm not all knowing, but those were experiences that we were having. And when we were doing those studies, I was always thinking, well, are livestock producers seeing the same thing? And then as we got into Behave and working with some of the folks and talking with them about their experiences, they were real honest. They said, we're going to be honest with you. Your animals have to adapt. You have to make the changes. And then you can think beyond that. I was reading papers that the soils and the plants and everything is adapting to the changes in behavior. I remember reading when people would go from inorganic to organic. So it'd be 3 to 5 years for all the changes that were going to occur in the life in those soils to occur. So very worthwhile question. And I'll throw in one more thing. I shouldn't forsake of time, but my wife and I have a daughter who's undergoing some major changes now, and she's in the 2nd year. And I keep telling Sue, well, it's this 3-year trough, and by the 3rd year, hopefully. But we go through those things too, huh? If you make a radical change in your life, move to a totally new place, you think of the 1st year, the 2nd year, the 3rd year, you gradually are making accommodating the change.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll continue on Catherine's second part because it really gets down to the heart of the thing. She's questioning, will mob grazing make this process take longer or not? And what I think she's asking is, and at least what I want her to be asking is, because this is what I really want you to elucidate with us, because it's still something I'm chewing on. It's not easy. Creating false herds, does this expedite? When I say false herds, to be very clear, what I mean is just a dense mob of life for no other reason than we just want to look at a mob, right? That's the reason. We're just focused on this massive pulsating form. creating those false energies help this process mature faster, or do they actually retard the process?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's the kind, when I was at Utah State University, we would have these kind of conversations all the time. And that's how our studies all went, is that, because I would take a question like that and I'd think, we could study that. We could study how, and we could study, to what degree are you confining those animals together, and to what degree are you allowing them to have some space so that they could perhaps be more, quote, in their families? It's a good question. I'm thinking again of something I alluded to quickly, but on when you're working animals in chutes and stuff, and you bring them in from, like on the ranch where I was talking with another fella last week about this with big cattle ranches working on, and how you will see these sequences of numbers come through the chute, so even though they're all in there bunched up together, they're still hanging out together with their group. So it's a really interesting topic that you raise of, to what degree does the mob itself influence the development of families and so forth. And that's where, going back to an earlier question, that's where I think just however a person does that, whether it's through ear tags, or I've been around people that, they just have very good visual kind of memory. They learn every animal in their herd by sight, but for me, it's being able to recognize the individuals and knowing their relationships, and then starting to pay attention to that, right? That goes back to the earlier question too, and to what degree they're hanging out together. Certainly young animals are exploratory. They love to interact with one another. And so we used to see that all the time on the mother-young work that we did, the young influencing one another as well. So there's a dynamic in there that can be quite interesting too, of what happens with families, and then interrelationships that might develop when you have all those families forced to be very close together. To me, it raises very, very interesting questions. And though you may not be able to study it in the sense that we would, you can certainly observe the dynamic of what's happening with all that, I think, and then become very knowledgeable, from simply being out there observing what's happening as you allow these things to co-evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you from personal experience, my wife and I, who run Timshel Wildland, are wildland here out in central Virginia, we learned a lot. We learned a lot when we wintered our herd in a much larger paddock in the back of the farm, about 60 acres. And there was this raise of a hill form, we called it a lookout, about 400 feet in elevation rise right above this open shrubland is really where it was. And there's a couple hundred head of cattle out there in the winter. And we just used to sit out there and we watched them, right? We would watch them ebb, and they would flow, and they would pulse. And one day, I've always wanted to put this in a book, and I've never really found a great set of words for it yet. But there's a black bear and a cub, a sow and a cub, that live just beyond this paddock in this little valley form. There's a den, and every year she raises a cub. It's brilliant. One time she came out, and it's impossible to see her coming out of the woods from the cattle's position. But in our raised position, we could see it. And it happened just in front of us like a movie. It was unbelievable. And the cows, they started to get together, right? And they kind of formed these, not a tight bunch, but you saw movement, right? Where there was bands of foraging herbivores, they started to pulse towards each other. And then the black bear just went on their way, and they spread out over about a half-hour period of time. And it was this unbelievable moment that we got to witness. And I don't know what it said. Maybe that's what I'm waiting for in order to put it in a book. What did it really say? But just that moment of observation. And I think, and I want to get to one last question here, but almost to sum up this talk, what I'm getting from this is when we're talking about mob grazing in pure stock density language, when we're focused on stock density as mob grazing, we're focused in some way on mathematics, on closing our eyes and just operating as we think we need to operate, singularly focused. Not necessarily evil or negative, as you said at the beginning brilliantly. There's values there, there's virtue even in there, and there's definitely abundance in terms of soil health. But what we're talking about here and understanding and observing the family is exactly that. It's observation-based management. It's taking time to look at these animals, let's say they're sheep or cows, whatever they are, and understanding the calves and the relationships, the aunts, the uncles coming into the actual scene and protecting and who's grazing with whom. It's an observation science. That's what I think that you're arguing for here. We're postulating that regenerative agriculture moving forward, to move forward in a regenerative way, we need more observation.
Absolutely absolutely the case. And you know, in that sense that you were talking, the observation that you made, if I were to send you that video of those bison, you know, that family is spread out a ways, but that grizzly bear comes, boy, they clump right up, and then they're, you know, they're on the but I think that's it. You know, and when I think of science and scientists over the years that I interacted with, the ones that had the most interesting kind of ideas and careers were ones that spent a lot of time observing. They were huge observers. They spent years and years because they just loved it. That's why, you know, I mean, it wasn't, I want to be a good scientist, so I'm going to, they just loved observing what was happening in nature, and it's all there. And so becoming observers, and then you can do little experiments on your own place in one way or another that occur to you. Well, if I do this, what do they do? You know, if I do that, what do they do? And so and it's every bit as valid, even though it would be considered, quote, anecdotal, it's every bit as valid as what we did over the years. That's always, it was conversations like this. And then we think, you know, that's really, really interesting. Let's set up a study of that. And then we always learned from the animals. You know, it's like, if it didn't fit with what we thought, whatever the animals were doing, we learned from them, right? We let them be our teachers, the plants and the animals both, in a really, in a great sense. And again, Daniel, you do a wonderful job of addressing that in your book. It's nice. You know, I think that's the flavor of it all, huh? Yeah. And you summed it up nicely just a minute or so ago.
Absolutely. Let's end on this question. It's I think a really good question to end with. Let's talk a little bit about scale. Anna here is postulating in a question that it seems that the allowance of family-based grazing systems depend a bit onto scale. Have you found, Fred, in your research, animal units? Is there a sweet spot where we're still, and I'm thinking here, and I think Anna is thinking here of smaller scale agriculture. Here in Central Virginia, our 400-acre wildland is a pretty big space, whereas where you're from, that's obviously a very small space. So let's think a little bit more eastern. That is on the eastern seaboard of the United States, smaller scale agriculture. What have you found in your research animal units, meaning that this sort of stock density per acre yields the ability for animals to be tight enough that there's still safety and protection and management ability, but you get to see these family units being expressed in the epigenetics and in the pasture landscape?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And, you know, it's out ahead of where we were when I ended my research in terms of just kind of scale and families as fits into that scale and so forth. So I can't say anything based upon our research other than, you know, what you're talking about is that's bound to be how that's going to happen. And then it would be, you know, what animal species and, you know, the family groups that people talk about or often end up anywhere from 15, 20, 25 animals, just as a kind of a number that people would talk about. So that's a kind of a scale that I often think about when they're talking about family units. And Bob Jackson, going back to Yellowstone and Bob, when we were, and I'll send you this video segment, Daniel, as well, that you can share. We sat for half a day along the Yellowstone watching this huge mob of bison down there in the Hayden Valley. And he was making a point to us back in those days. You watch when they take off, they're not going to take off as one group. They're going to take off as little subgroups. And certainly that's what happened. You know, there'd be a group here and that would take off. And then he would make a point that I found really interesting. He said, you know, once these families reach a certain size, and I don't know if he would have been able to speculate on how big, he said that they'll form satellite groups. They'll break off into other groups, you know, and it's like, yeah, that makes sense too. All these kind of things that we never got a chance to actually formally study would have been fascinating kind of things. But all that then starts to tie back to that question of, you know, how big. And you know what I'll do too, Daniel, I've been meaning to send Bob Jackson a note about this. And I'll send him a note and ask him, because that's what he's dealing with the bison on his property, is extended families. When he harvests bison, he harvests an entire family, again, with some of the emotional kind of sacredness part that we talk about. And I'll send him a note and ask him about what he thinks scale-wise relative to families and land, and thinking back east as well, where you may not have quite so big of properties, but on the other hand, you have in many places have moisture and more productivity. So all that enters into that animal units and scale kind of question, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Anna, if you learn anything, keep us posted. I think that's what Fred is saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll check with Bob, and we'll use Daniel here as a vehicle to get out some of the follow-up thoughts on all of this we're discussing.
I like that. Absolutely. Well, Fred, with that, I don't want to take any more of your time. Thank you so much for being here. I know this was pivotal for me. I hope everybody else in that showed up to this webinar are leaving with something. I could tell you we started with about 80% of the people that are still here, which is an unbelievable fact, seeing that we've ran far over the timeline. And so, Fred, thank you for being here. Thank you. I can't thank you enough. Let's keep this going and do many more in the future. We appreciate the time.
And thanks to you, Daniel, and all the folks who took the time to sit in and listen and then participate. Very much appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, everybody have a great 2022, and we'll see you next time.